This week, Ripple transferred $108 million worth of XRP directly to Coinbase. On the surface, that looks like one thing: Ripple selling. The price didn't move much. Retail barely noticed. A few bearish accounts pointed at it as evidence of sell pressure. They read it exactly backwards. That $108 million transfer is not Ripple liquidating its position. It is Ripple restocking the shelves, supplying the OTC desk and ETF-authorized participants with the volume they need to fulfill institutional purchase orders without crashing the market. And here is the part that changes the entire read on that transfer. Since April 10th, XRP spot ETFs have recorded net inflows of $67.47 million every single day. Not weekly, not monthly, every day, with 0 days of net outflows in the entire period. When institutional buyers are absorbing $67 million per day through ETF products, and the OTC desks that supply those products are running low on inventory, Ripple sending $108 million to Coinbase is not a sell signal. It is a restock, and restocks happen when shelves are getting empty. Here is why the shelf depletion thesis matters more than any price chart this week. OTC desks, the institutional supply channels that allow large buyers to acquire XRP without moving the public exchange price, have a finite inventory. They source XRP from large holders, from escrow releases, and from direct transfers like the one Ripple just made to Coinbase. When OTC inventory depletes faster than it is replenished, two things happen. First, the restock transfers get larger and more frequent, which is exactly what we are seeing. Second, when the OTC desk runs out entirely, ETF-authorized participants and large institutional buyers are forced to go to public exchange order books to fill their orders. And when institutional-scale buyers hit public order books, they move price fast, in one direction. The $108 million transfer is the restock before the shelves go empty. So here is the question that the restock thesis forces. If Ripple is sending $108 million to Coinbase specifically to supply institutional purchase orders, and ETFs are absorbing $67 million per day with no sign of inflow slowdown, how many days does the current OTC inventory last? And what happens to the price on the day the OTC desk runs out and the institutional buyers have to go to the open market? Welcome to XRP News Flow Signals, where we read the transfer data, not just the price data. This is not financial advice, but if you want to understand why the week's most bearish-looking signal is actually the most bullish supply development in this cycle, and what it implies for price when the supply chain runs thin, stay with me. We read the mechanics, not the narrative. Let's start with the precise mechanics of how institutional XRP acquisition actually works, because most retail analysis completely misunderstands the OTC supply chain. When a large institutional buyer, a hedge fund, a family office, an ETF-authorized participant, wants to acquire a significant amount of XRP, they do not go to Coinbase's public order book and buy. Buying that volume on a public exchange would move the price against them before the order is even half filled. Their average cost would spike. The position becomes inefficient. Instead, they go to an OTC desk. An OTC desk, in XRP's case, operated through brokers like Coinbase Prime, Galaxy Digital, and other institutional market makers, sources the tokens off-market, aggregates them from large holders, and delivers them to the institutional buyer at an agreed price without touching the public order book. This is why exchange-visible price action often does not reflect institutional accumulation. The accumulation is happening off-exchange, through OTC channels, invisibly to retail chart watchers. Now connect this to the Ripple transfer. The article framing of Ripple's $108 million transfer to Coinbase noted that the transaction aligns with Coinbase's role as an authorized participant and custodian for XRP ETFs. The framing is correct. Ripple is not selling at market. It is supplying the institutional supply chain with the inventory required to fulfill ETF creation orders. ETF creation works like this. When new ETF shares are created, the authorized participant, in this case Coinbase Prime, must deliver XRP to the ETF custodian. To deliver XRP, the authorized participant needs XRP inventory. When their OTC inventory is low, they need a restock from large holders like Ripple. The $108 million transfer is the restock. And the reason a restock was needed, 67.47 million per day in ETF inflows since April 10th, every single day, creating demand for new ETF shares, which requires authorized participants to deliver XRP, which drains OTC inventory. The supply chain is moving. The shelves are getting thinner. The restock is Ripple's response. But here's the part that the OTC depletion thesis alone doesn't explain. And it's the development this week that shows the institutional demand side of this equation is not just coming from ETF buyers. It's coming from an entirely different direction that most people watching XRP have not connected to the supply picture. And when you hear which institutions are now actively building XRP-adjacent infrastructure this week, the daily inflow number starts to look like the floor, not the ceiling. Let's talk about the demand-side developments this week, because institutional XRP demand is no longer coming from a single source. NEOM times Ripple times Coinbase. NEOM, the $500 billion Saudi Arabian megacity project, has partnered with Ripple as an ODL, on-demand liquidity customer, and simultaneously partnered with Coinbase to enable USDC stablecoin payments across its platform, describing the future of cross-border settlement as multi-rail. The multi-rail framing is the signal. NEOM is not choosing between XRP and stablecoins. They are building a settlement infrastructure that runs multiple rails simultaneously, stablecoins for some corridors, ODL for others, and where XRP functions as the bridge asset when moving between stablecoin ecosystems. Here is the specific mechanism. A payment entering the NEOM ecosystem as USDC needs to exit as USDT on the other side. The counterparty prefers Tether. The sender holds USDC. The bridge between those two stablecoins, the neutral settlement layer that converts USDC to XRP and XRP to USDT in seconds, is XRP's on-demand liquidity. This is not a future use case. This is the operational architecture NEOM is building with Ripple as an existing ODL customer. Bank of Korea. The Bank of Korea's new chief publicly committed to pushing Cbdc deposit tokens, moving away from legacy stablecoin approaches towards central bank-issued digital money. South Korea's regulatory and financial community has historically been among the most XRP-aligned in the world. Korea's previous central bank Cbdc pilot work has included XRP Ledger compatibility testing. The Bank of Korea's Cbdc direction is a direct pipeline into XRP Ledger infrastructure demand. United Kingdom. The UK published plans to integrate payment regulation covering both stablecoins and tokenized deposits, creating a regulatory framework where digital assets and traditional bank deposits operate on the same legal rails. Every stablecoin and tokenized deposit that moves through UK-regulated payment infrastructure across borders requires the same bridge currency mechanism that XRP was designed to provide. 3 separate institutional demand signals in the same week, each one from a different geography, each one pointing at the same architectural requirement: a neutral, instant, low-cost bridge asset connecting stablecoin ecosystems, CBDCs, and tokenized assets across jurisdictions. Now, before we get to the supply math, because the depletion calculation is something most channels never actually run, I want to address something that came up in institutional commentary this week that reveals exactly what sophisticated investors who dismiss XRP are still misunderstanding. And when you see what a well-known institutional figure said about XRP this week, and why his analysis is stuck in 2017, the entire current institutional picture looks completely different. Let's address an institutional commentary that appeared this week, because it illustrates exactly what outdated XRP analysis looks like, when applied to a fundamentally different infrastructure landscape. Mark Yusko, a well-known institutional investor, stated publicly this week that Ripple's bank will never launch and that he would bet on a competitor over Ripple in the banking space. His framing was confident, his dismissal was categorical. But the basis for his dismissal is stuck in a version of XRP that has not existed since 2021. The critique that a bank could send billions with $10 worth of XRP that lasts 20 years, reflecting a 2017 white paper reading about XRP as a minimal friction settlement token, misses the architectural evolution that has occurred since then. In 2017, XRP's use case was narrow: cross-border remittance liquidity. The value proposition was efficiency in a single corridor. In 2026, XRP's infrastructure encompasses prime brokerage, Ripple Prime, $3 trillion annual volume; corporate treasury management, G Treasury, $13 trillion annual volume; institutional custody for Citibank, BBVA, DBS, and Standard Chartered through Medico; Cbdc pilot infrastructure across multiple central banks; tokenized asset settlement on the XRP Ledger; RLUSD stablecoin as eligible institutional collateral; and OTC supply chain for 7 spot ETFs with $1.37 billion in cumulative inflows. The analyst reading a 2017 white paper to dismiss a 2026 infrastructure stack is not engaged in analysis. He is engaged in confirmation of a conclusion he formed before the evidence existed. The critique is outdated. The infrastructure being built on top of XRP rails is not. And this brings us to the supply math, the number that most channels never actually calculate. Because when you take the $67.47 million daily inflow figure and run it against the documented supply picture, exchange reserves, OTC inventory, ETF custody lockup, the depletion timeline becomes something very specific. And that specific timeline is the most important number in the current XRP market. Let me show you. Because connecting the $108 million Ripple restock to the $67 million daily ETF inflows, to NEOM's multi-rail architecture, to the Bank of Korea's CBDC direction, to the outdated institutional critique, as a single coherent supply and demand picture, is the analytical work this channel does every week. If you want this signal layer in your feed consistently, subscribe to XRP News Flow Signals right now and turn on notifications. Because the supply math I am about to run is the number that shows you exactly where the OTC depletion timeline sits. And you want that framework before the exchange order books start feeling the institutional demand that OTC can no longer absorb alone. Let's run the depletion math, because this is where the $67.47 million daily inflow figure becomes structurally alarming for available supply. Daily ETF demand, $67.47 million per day since April 10th. That is approximately $2 billion per month in XRP being removed from the tradable float through ETF custody at current run rates. Cumulative ETF lockup, $1.37 billion in total cumulative inflows, with 773 million XRP tokens already locked in ETF custody. That is nearly 1% of total XRP supply locked in ETF products that launched less than 6 months ago. Exchange reserves at 8-year lows. The tokens available for institutional buyers to acquire on public exchanges or through OTC desks have been declining continuously for months. The restock signal, Ripple's $108 million transfer to Coinbase, tells you that OTC inventory was running low enough to require a direct, large holder restock. That is not a routine operational transfer. It is a supply chain response to depletion pressure. The math, at $67.47 million per day in ETF demand against an OTC supply chain that required a $108 million emergency restock. The pressure on available liquid supply is not theoretical. It is operational and documented. When OTC desks run out, when authorized participants must go to public exchange order books to fill ETF creation orders, the price impact is not gradual. Exchange order books are significantly thinner than OTC inventory. Institutional scale buying against a thin order book produces rapid directional price movement. The question is not whether this happens. The question is what the timeline looks like. And the restock that just occurred tells you. The timeline is already compressing. Let's close with the structural argument that makes XRP's bridge role not optional, but mathematically necessary in the emerging financial system. The world is splitting into two digital money camps. The United States is building stablecoin infrastructure, USDC, RLUSD, Tether, regulated, dollar-pegged, private sector issued. Korea, Europe, China, and multiple emerging market economies are building Cbdc infrastructure, central bank-issued, government-controlled, currency-specific. Both camps will need to interact. A U.S. company paying a Korean supplier, a European bank settling with a UAE counterparty, an AI agent executing a cross-border trade. These transactions will originate in one digital money system and need to arrive in another. The bridge between them, the neutral asset that converts USDC to the Korean won Cbdc, or RLUSD to the digital euro, in seconds, at fractions of a cent, without pre-funded correspondent accounts, is not USDC. It is not a Cbdc. It is a neutral bridge asset with no national affiliation, instant settlement, and sufficient liquidity to handle institutional scale flows. There is exactly one asset in the digital economy engineered from day one for precisely this role. The $27 trillion sitting in Nostro and Vostro accounts globally, capital-locked and correspondent banking chains to lubricate cross-border settlement, represents the demand pool that XRP's on-demand liquidity was specifically designed to unlock. That capital does not stay locked because banks want it locked. It stays locked because no alternative can match the speed and cost requirements of cross-border institutional settlement at scale. XRP can, and the infrastructure to prove it has been building for 14 years. Let me leave you with the complete frame. Ripple sent $108 million to Coinbase this week. Retail read it as selling. It was a restock, a supply chain response to OTC depletion driven by $67.47 million per day in ETF inflows that have not recorded a single day of net outflows since April 10th. NEOM is building a multi-rail settlement architecture that uses XRP as the bridge between USDC and USDT. The Bank of Korea is pushing Cbdc deposit tokens with a regulatory and financial community historically aligned with XRP Ledger infrastructure. The UK is integrating stablecoin and tokenized deposit regulation that requires exactly the cross-ecosystem bridge function XRP provides. The institutional critics reading 2017 white papers to dismiss 2026 infrastructure are not wrong about 2017. They are simply not reading 2026. The $27 trillion entrapped Nostro and Vostro capital. The tokenization wave requiring a bridge between ecosystems. The Cbdc versus stablecoin split that makes a neutral bridge currency not a nice-to-have, but a mathematical necessity. XRP is not waiting for permission to be relevant. It is already running 14 years of continuous ledger operation. The infrastructure is built. The supply is thinning. The restocks are happening. The shelves are getting empty. If this supply chain read of the $108 million transfer changed how you see the current market, subscribe to XRP News Flow Signals before the OTC desk depletion becomes the headline. We track the transfer data, the ETF inflows, and the supply chain mechanics before the exchange order books reflect what the OTC desks already know. Drop one word below. Restock. If the $108 million inversion landed as the bullish signal it is, let's see who is reading the supply chain. Stay sharp. The signal does not lie. Not financial advice. Always conduct your own research.